everyone. Thank you for tuning into the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. It's November 2018, and you're listening to episode 98 of Postmodern Realities, and I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. On this episode, I'm joined by Drew Dixon, who is the chief content nerd at Love Thy Nerd and the editor of Explore the Bible Students. Drew has written about video games from a Christian worldview for more than 8 years, and his writing has been featured in many magazines, including Christianity Today, World Magazine, and Christ and Pop Culture. In the 2018 Volume 41, Number 5 issue, which is out now, of the Christian Research Journal, Drew has written a feature-length Postmodern Realities column, and the Postmodern Realities column is written by millennials for millennials, but millennial authors address primarily but not exclusively members of their own generation regarding Christian apologetic issues, both theological and cultural, as well as pop culture trends, including film, literature, and technology. So Drew's article is called Virtual Violence, Video Game Addiction, and the Kingdom of God. Drew, it's good to have you on.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks so much.
Well, the opening kind of example or thing that you open your article with is the recent shooting, actual fatal shooting of a player that was playing a online sports video game at a specific, I guess, kind of was its competition?
It was a big
tournament.
Yeah.
So kind of set the stage for us. What happened with that particular situation, which I'm sure our listeners might have heard about it on their news?
Sure, yeah. Back in August in Jacksonville, Florida, a professional Madden player, which Madden is the leading NFL football game. I think it's the only licensed NFL football game. But it's a hugely popular football video game. And this guy lost apparently in the tournament. And it seems like the story is that he got upset about having lost in this tournament and decided to go back to the tournament after he'd been eliminated with a gun and opened fire on people at this gaming tournament in a bar in Jacksonville and killed 2 people and wounded 9 others before taking his own life. So yeah, I think people heard about that and then immediately kind of thought of the 2 things that are most often cited against video games, and that's their violent content and of course, this idea of addiction, which is something that people are talking a lot about now. And so, obviously to play at a high level in any kind of video game, you have to spend a lot of time. And so, it's kind of assumed this guy must be playing too many video games and he's not, he's no longer able to control his emotions. It's kind of the fear we have about all of our kids when we turn off the the PlayStation or whatever, and they flip out and get upset about it. And we assume that's kind of what happened here, or that's what people assume happened here. And so it opened up a lot of conversations about both addiction and violent content in video games that, I think a lot of times the headlines don't necessarily correspond with reality. And so, as Christians, it's really important that we get to the truth of these things. How big of a problem is video game addiction? How big of a problem is violence? And is violence linked to real world aggression? Those are questions I think we want to ask responsibly and critically and thoughtfully as Christians.
I know that some of our listeners might not know, but some of the things that have become big in terms of tournaments is there's actually things called esports where people are playing in teams competitively, both at the college level and professional level. And most of the teams, I think, are primarily all young men, males from various different countries, usually quite young, aged, 22 or younger. I think as you get older, maybe your reflexes aren't that good. So in case people wanted to know, is it such a thing that people are playing tournaments? There are. And in fact, I think ESPN on, sports television even covers some of these esports events. So,
they do.
So they are becoming, a phenomenon that is probably a multi-million-dollar business with, a lot of prize money.
And there's certainly, right. Yeah, and there's certainly women that participate in it too, but it is a male-dominated, primarily "quote unquote" sport. Some people might object to me calling it a sport, but yeah, there are all kinds of professional gamers these days that they do this as a career.
And also, some people might not know that not only are people professional gamers on teams or competing at tournaments, I just said mainly young males because it's not something I would watch, but I was at a restaurant where instead of the normal football or whatever was on, all the TVs were put to esports. I'm like, wow, there's like these kids playing like full on video games in a tournament. Um, but there's a lot of people who have big followings on social media, whether it be on something called
Mm-hmm.
Twitch, which parents might not know about, which is a site that features gaming, both analog gaming and video gaming, primarily video gaming and other kinds of events like that, where people will subscribe to channels and watch people play video games, as well as people who have, done this on YouTube for many years, where they have a following of people playing video games. As a matter of fact, one channel that I've come across that's quite popular, and I think she has more than almost 300,000 subscribers, is a lady who is a senior citizen in her 80s, and she's a video gamer, and many
Mm-hmm.
people subscribe to her channel. So, yes, there are women that are video gaming. But getting back to this question that I know that a lot of our listeners and probably parents and grandparents and those kinds of folks are wondering about the impact of violent video games on the people that are actually playing them. So give us a little background. What do most of the recent studies say about the impact of video games? And can you define for us, when people think of a quote unquote violent video game, what are they really describing? What kind of game is that?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think most of the time when we talk about violent video games, we're talking about games with graphic violence. So the Madden tournament's kind of maybe outside that, because although football is itself a violent sport, it's not what people tend to think of when we think of violent video games. So there's a lot of video games. The most popular ones are first-person shooters, where you're shooting enemies with guns, many of which sometimes they're aliens, but a lot of times they're human, simulated. A lot of violent video games are competition, competitive games like Fortnite or Overwatch, where you're shooting other players, characters that they're controlling. But most of the time when we talk about violence video games, we're talking about games that simulate like murder, essentially, right? Games that simulate killing other people. So, but yeah, the current research on the connection between violent video games and real world aggression it's really hard to get to the bottom of, honestly. Hundreds of studies in recent years have been done to try to ascertain some kind of connection, some kind of clear connection between aggression and violent video games. And basically, the jury's still out. There's no real consensus among researchers on the impact of virtual violence on real world aggressive behavior. And so some studies have found some correlation between real world aggressive behavior and playing violent video games, but they haven't been able to determine clear causation, that they're actually causing this behavior, because these studies don't account all kinds of other things that factor into whether kids behave aggressively, like problems in the home or school, stress at school. There's all kinds of other things that they're not adequately addressing when they make these connections. So the most recent study is a meta-analysis of 24 studies that looked at 24 prominent studies on violent video games. And the big headline about this study was, hey, we've discovered a connection, right? Like, there's clearly a connection here between violent video games and aggressive behavior. But in reality, the less than 1% of the variance in aggression in that study is explained by exposure to game violence. So it's this really, really, really small connection, right? And so that's important to note, because reality doesn't quite measure up to some of the crazy headlines we see some days. And so that's important for us as Christians, I think, because we need to, we should care about the truth, right? And if it's being presented as a bigger problem than it actually is, that's something, we need to be aware of. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't care about violent video games, or that violent video games aren't having any impact on people. I don't think that's quite fair to say either. But I think we need to stop raising so much moral panic about it, because it's not quite as clear cut of a issue to be really, really worried about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it does make sense, but it's still, as a mom, and I know a lot of other moms, if they've talked about video gaming and their kids, and you just mentioned some really popular games that are out right now. 2018 has been pretty much the year of a game called Fortnite, but they're older games that, like, people used to play. I don't know, Jill. I'm assuming people still play Call of Duty, which was kind of like a simulation war game, right?
Yeah, there's a brand new Call of Duty game out that just came out a few weeks
So
ago.
I think that's probably the
So yeah,
most famous first-person shooter,
sure,
although I
yeah.
don't know how many kids are actually playing that compared to, like, as you mentioned, Overwatch and for sure Fortnite. But, the reality of parents just seeing their kids, primarily sons, not always, but just usually it's the moms of boys, talking about their sons playing these games and really being, just enamored by them, spending a lot of time on them. How are Christians to
hmm
discern that? Like, do these violent video games have any place in the life of a Christian, especially Christian boys that are, still developing mentally? I mean, I think that studies even said, the male brain doesn't fully develop till 25. So you've got these middle school kids and high school boys spending time connecting with friends, playing these games. And how do we have discernment as
Yeah,
parents about how to handle these games?
sure. So I think it's important to note that there's a lot like the also when I said video game violence isn't this big problem that we think it is, I'm not suggesting that people just go let their kids play whatever games they want. I think it's really important that we think about what's age appropriate for our children. So I would really encourage parents to like research games, see what they think is age appropriate for their kids. Um, the ESRB is a great resource for that, where you can go and check the rating and why things are rated the way they are, why games are rated, mature, 17 plus, or why it's rated teen, 14 and up or whatever. Also, Twitch is a great resource. You mentioned Twitch earlier. You can get on Twitch and see and actually watch some of these games and see what their content's like, so that you can decide for your children whether that's appropriate. But there's tons of benefits that come from playing video games in moderation. They teach us problem solving skills in moderation. When we play, reasonable amounts of time, games can help us develop problem solving skills, teach us resilience. They can help us be more productive. They can actually be good for our brain for things like concentration and memory and pattern recognition. They provide us opportunities for social bonding. When a lot of times video games are social, we're playing with other people and spending time together. That's primarily how I play games with my kids. My kids they're young. They don't really get their own game time very often, where they're just playing without me. So I'm playing with them. So it's a time for, it's daddy-daughter time for us. But again, all those benefits begin to drop drastically when we play for stretches of 3 or more hours. So, I think that's evidence of God's design for our need to set limits on how we engage with some good things in creation, right? We need to set limits for those things so that we don't begin to abuse them. And those good things in creation don't begin controlling our attitude or our behavior or our development, So, yeah, I think the basic, like the quick answer there is we need to help children set limits and boundaries, and they don't know how to set limits a lot of times for themselves. If we let them, they like my kids, their thing is like if we let them, they would watch TV all day, right? But they need me as the parent to step in and go like, no, that's not good for your development. We're going to set a really clear limit on one show a day. That's what we do. I'm not saying that's what's right for everybody, but that's our stance.
There were recent articles in various media, including the New York Times, just talking about how people who have created technology and video games, for example, in Silicon Valley, have seen just the negative parts of it in terms of development. You're talking about kids, and where they themselves, people who work in tech, don't allow their kids to play video games, or those famous examples where, when he was alive, Steve Jobs didn't let his kids have iPads, and Bill Gates forbid his kids to, have smartphones until they were later teens and so forth. So how if that's true of people who work in tech every single day developing some of this stuff, how should Christian parents, decide like what's an age appropriate time to introduce technology? And, if there's concerns from the creators of technology, how do we balance that with, like you said, there could be some benefits for it, having community with friends and so forth?
Sure. Yeah, it's really hard with regard to community because so many of our kids, their friends have phones and their kids are playing Fortnite and they don't have the same limits. Like that's the issue with us too. Like there's kids down the street from my 7-year-old daughter who they don't have phones, but they have their like parents' old phone, Their parents let them use their own phone and they can get on Wi-Fi. It's, there's no data signal, it's not like connected to Verizon or something, but they can get on whoever's Wi-Fi that they have, and they'll come over here and watch YouTube videos, and I send them home. I say, you can play at our house, but you can't play at our house with your phone, because otherwise I have to sit there and watch and make sure you're not watching anything that you shouldn't be on YouTube. Because, I mean, we both know there's all kinds of things on YouTube that a 7-year-old little girl doesn't need to be getting into. And so yeah, it's tough. And especially and like with Fortnite, these kids, if you're trying to set limits on how much your kids play video games and your friends are not having those same limits, you're going to have a lot of begging and gnashing of teeth from your kid about, why can't I play Fortnite more? So I get it. It's hard. But I do think that, yeah, our kids need those limits. And I don't have like the answer to what the age is at which, a kid should be able to have a smartphone. I think at any age, like even older teens, I would suggest really thinking carefully about like finding some software that helps you limit how often they can access the internet on those devices. We were just talking about that before the show. I think that's really wise. But yeah, I think the fact that some of these CEOs of tech companies and things are not crazy about what it's doing to their kids and things is probably evidence that we need to be mindful of how they engage them. But also, let's like pump the brakes and not just assume that these things have no value. There's tremendous social connection that comes from social media. There are relationships that we can develop there. There are opportunities for mission on social media and in video games. And so let's not throw it out completely. Let's set a good example for our kids. Let's teach them how to engage those things responsibly. But yeah, the worst thing I think you can do is just give in, right, to sort of the culture's. A lot of parents, like especially if they're not maybe, not Christians or not very mindful of how their kids engage media and stuff, they just sort of throw up their hands and be like, well, this is the world that we live in. And I think that's probably the worst thing that you can do. So any parent who's listening to this, I would say stick in there, like be strong, set boundaries, stick with them. You're not alone in this fight. There's, look for parents who can encourage you and help you stay strong in these things, because it is hard to deal with your kids.
You're listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast from the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. Today's guest is Drew Dixon, and in the 2018 Volume 41, Number 5 issue, which is out now, of the Christian Research Journal, he's written this feature-length Postmodern Realities column, and it's called Virtual Violence, Video Game Addiction, and the Kingdom of God. And to read his article, please subscribe to the journal. A 6-issue subscription is now at a new lower price of $33.50. And to subscribe online, visit equip.org. We were just talking about how to have discernment as parents about, time limits and usage of devices, which are places where kids can play video games or watch video games being played. But I also wanted to recommend to parents specifically a device. I mean, I'm not paid to promote this or anything. It's a device that we use in our own home, and it's called Circle. It's actually a device by Disney, of all things. And it's about $100, and you can do everything on it. You can put every single solitary smartphone, any kind of electronic device, your computer, a smartphone, a tablet, all onto this device. And it's got various different features. And the cool thing is, even it can help parents set a good example, because you can set a limit of time that it allows you to interact with a particular site. Maybe for parents, it's news. Maybe for kids, it's games. Maybe for teenagers, it's social media. And so it will turn your device off when you've reached your time limit or provide you with reports to know how long you've been spending. And then the thing I like is that it'll shut down the internet per device. So if you want your teenager, for example, to make sure that they're getting their homework done, if they know that all their electronic devices will stop being able to access the Wi-Fi at, say, 10:30 at night, then they've got to be, really organized, get their homework done. And the only thing it won't do, I will say, is if you actually have a smartphone and you're on data, then you can go around that. But anything that's connected to your Wi-Fi, you can even pause the internet. If your kid won't get off their video game, you can actually pause the internet and make sure that they're not playing too long, as you talked about, the 3 hour.
Yeah,
so I just want to tell parents about that device, because there are things out there, resources for parents. Earlier this year, I did do another podcast on this topic, and I feel like this could be multiple podcasts. There's so much to talk about. And we briefly mentioned the recent World Health Organization's new classification of a gaming disorder as a type of disease. And I just want to talk about that again in case someone else missed that other podcast about why this is particularly significant. And, if there is enough evidence to call it a disease, how widespread is this disease if it's the World Health Organization?
Yeah, well, it's significant because the World Health Organization hardly ever adds new diseases to the ICD-11, which is the 11th International Classification of Diseases, which is sort of this premier international tool for diagnosing diseases. So it's really important because if something gets added to that, that means there's probably going to be a lot more research into that topic and into how to treat it. And so it was kind of shocking, actually, to a lot of people that gaming disorder was added to this list, because it's not actually like as nearly as big of a problem as we might think that it is. And what I mean by that is probably less than 1% of gamers, probably just under, most experts seem to say that just under 1% of gamers are addicted or would qualify as addicted to video games. And so it's not this massive problem that we think that it is. What I think is a big problem sometimes in video game world is kids playing too much, overuse, overindulgence. But most kids who play video games, most people who play video games, and by the way, it's not kids, right? We keep talking about kids, but the average gamer is 35, somewhere in there, is in his 30s, his or her 30s. And 40-something% of gamers are women too. So we really need to kind of stop talking about it as just a male thing as well. It's a huge thing. 220 million Americans play video games. So anyway, all that to say, addiction really isn't a problem so much as, or a widespread problem. But what I think is kids probably playing a little more than is healthy, or sometimes a good bit more than is healthy. So we need to be able to have conversations without accusing kids of being addicted, right? Or accusing our friends of being addicted, but able to have those conversations about what does healthy, like responsible play look like.
Well, and, just if somebody, and specifically, I think, parents listening to this, kids, whatever that means, middle school, teenage, college age kids aren't technically addicted in that 1%. It seems like to the parent that they, quote unquote, they are addicted. In other words, how do we know when our kids are developing an unhealthy relationship? And maybe it's not our kids. Maybe it's our boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse, because frankly, in the old days, I think they changed the privacy settings. I could see a lot of friends like, hey, they're playing Candy Crush right now, or they've invited you. I'm like, don't you have other stuff to do? Why are you playing Candy Crush in the middle of the day?
Sure.
Moms, staying at home moms or something. And the other thing is, I actually know, it's not just anecdotal, but I actually have friends that basically their son, flunked out of college because all he went there and all he did was play video games. And I can see that. I know when my son was a freshman in college, I remember one time I was visiting him, we left and there were some guys in their dorm room, then their door was open, they were playing video games, and we came back like 3 hours later and they hadn't moved. They're still playing video games. So it's a concern. So how do we have that discernment, or how do we approach it?
Yeah. Well, and even in that, I think we generally know when it's negatively affecting someone. And that's when you step in. That's when you step in and say, hey, let me help you develop some better better habits here, is when it's affecting their daily life, right? Their daily activities, their interests. If grades are suffering and the only thing that's changed in your son or daughter's life is that they started playing Fortnite, like that probably tells you something, and if you're a decent parent, right, how much time they're playing Fortnite. And so, yeah, if it's negatively affecting our lives and the lives of people around us or our home life, then we know something's amiss. But context is key too. Like those kids in the dorm room, like the benefits for your brain go way down when you play in 3-hour plus segments. But if those students, they've got their homework done, maybe it's the weekend and they've been studying all week and they want to get their buddies together and have like a big tournament playing, whatever game they like that's not concerning, right? But that's what I'm saying is context, is key in all these situations. Like what's going on in their lives? Like, do they have freedom at this moment to do that? Or are they shirking other responsibilities? And when we're, shirking other responsibilities, real world relationships, homework, jobs, those kinds of things are suffering because of our gaming, then we know it's time to step in and have some important conversations.
I think one thing you also hear from parents is, or pointing to articles that talk about, like we were talking about earlier about tech, and articles about people who've created these video games, talking about video games, altering just kind of the neurological pathways in our brain. So I just want to talk about that. So there have been a lot of articles and various, like you said, there's hundreds, if not thousands of studies about areas in the brain associated with, the pleasures of drug use, or even, people have compared the same kind of endorphin or addiction to pornography with the pathways
Right.
with the brain as video games. So,
Mm-hmm.
is that research definitive, first of all, and should we be concerned about that for our, spouses and boyfriend, girlfriends, or friends or kids? And also, I once read this article, boy, I should have kept it. It was many years ago, more than 15 years ago, in the LA Times, where it talked about how people who were video game designers went to go work for people designing slot machines because they knew what would keep people coming
Sure.
back and hook them to want to go to the next level, the next level, the next level. Like, I've got a
Yeah.
beat, and it's like, how many levels are there
Right.
in, I don't even know, Mario? There
Yeah.
might be 50 or something. So have they specifically designed those things to keep players wanting to master the next
Mm-hmm.
level?
Yeah. Everything in our culture these days just about is designed to keep us coming back. So it's not just a problem with the video games. So we'll get to more of that in a minute. But I do think there is something there that we need to talk about. But I'll try to answer the question about our brain. So yes, playing video games does trigger a release of dopamine in your brain, which is also triggered when you do drugs, mind-altering drugs. But it's also it's the pleasure center in the brain. So these are the areas of the brain that produce, that we get a release of dopamine in our brain when we do just about anything enjoyable or pleasurable. So scoring a goal in soccer, or tackling someone in football, making a nice tackle that's a big play for your team, having sex, having a nice conversation, eating a really good, cheeseburger, reading a really, nice segment of a book that's really enjoyable or really funny. Like, we get those releases of dopamine. So when people say it, it's the same pleasure center as drugs or pornography, that's pretty misleading, actually. I think we need to stop being worried about that so much, because the amount of dopamine released by playing a video game is roughly equivalent to eating like a slice of pizza. Whereas I talk about in this article, whereas smoking a methamphetamine results in a release of dopamine about 10 times more potent. So I don't think the level of dopamine release that you're getting from playing video games is necessarily something we should start a moral panic over. So that's kind of one of the issues that I think, where that sort of headline is really not helpful. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't be aware of some of the mechanics and things that are going on in video games that are designed to keep us coming back again and again and again for more and more dopamine releases. Of course, we should be aware of those things. I think we really need to be mindful of that. In fact, there are some mechanics in video games, things like loot boxes or just the way games reward players. A lot of times they use these variable reward ratios, which is very similar to a slot machine. So, in other words, like a loot box is like you win this loot box after playing for so long or winning a game or whatever, and you don't know what's going to come out when you open it. So you open it up and you may get something really cool or you may get something kind of lame, but it's that, and a lot of times it's like a new costume for your character or a new weapon or a new dance that your character can do. Some people hearing this may think I'm being facetious, but it's real. Like that's the way games are rewarding players. And so not knowing whether you're going to get a good reward or not keeps players coming back and playing more and more. And I think that's sort of like not the best reason to keep playing, right? Like myself and my friends and my children and the people around me play video games for more intrinsic rather than those sort of like silly extrinsic rewards. And I think more people would do well to understand how those things operate, that it's basically like a slot machine. Now, I will say this, like Overwatch is a game that uses those loot boxes. And I don't know that that's really the reason why kids are playing Overwatch. It is a reason. I think the primary reason why people play Overwatch is because it's a really fun team-based game that requires really good teamwork and organization. And so that thrill of working together to accomplish a goal is ultimately the biggest reason why people are playing that game. But if it's the loot boxes that keep you coming back, that's not a great reason to play that game or for anybody to play a game. And so I do think we need to be really aware of these things. A lot of mobile games use it too. Like a lot of these really popular mobile games keep you coming back again and again for those types of rewards. And I don't think it's the healthiest reason to play, and certainly would want to help people be more aware of that. There's been talk of including some warning labels about that kind of thing on games. They do some of that in the UK actually, and I think that's really helpful. I'd like to see the industry in the United States move in that direction as well, where some of that information would be included on the label of video games.
And I also want to just, not that anecdotal stories mean anything, but I don't want to have parents unnecessarily panicked by our conversation, but also say I have a international student from China who's a fairly serious video gamer. He likes video games and does play a first-person shooter. He's not a Christian that lives with me, and he plays Overwatch, and then I don't allow my youngest son, who's in high school, to play any kind of first-person shooter. But I will say for my Chinese student is he has a lot of self-control. He does like to play that game, but he always does his homework, and he's been busy the last month, and he was just recently remarking to me that he didn't have time to play Overwatch. So there are, for sure, students who, and he's very, very studious and his homework comes first and he's very motivated to get good grades. So here's a kid who likes to play Overwatch. He's played it for several years now, but yet, if he doesn't have time for an entire month, he doesn't play Overwatch. So I just want parents to say that there are kids out there that are, doing it in moderation.
And you know what? He probably learned some of that, right? From some responsible adults in his life who helped him to learn those priorities.
Yeah.
So that kind of the importance of
and also I think too, and that could be just that's another discussion, a cultural thing, but they put such a high value on education and doing well, whereas American students, some of them may not be as motivated as maybe some other Asian students, but I want to say he's playing very responsibly. But yet as a parent, it's not one he knows. He doesn't expose my son to that game. My son's not allowed to play it. So, it looks different in every family. So what does it look like? I guess, that's a non-Christian student that's, playing Overwatch in a responsible manner. But what about Christians? What does it look like to engage in video games in a way that honors Christ? And then also, I have actually gone on to the Facebook page of Drew's ministry, Love Thy Nerd, and asked that question of just kind of some of the community in there. Like, okay, tell me, my kid doesn't play Fortnite. What are some good games if he wants to play, on occasion with friends, like we talked about community, because they don't drive. They're all at different houses all over the city. What are some good games? So can you recommend games that would be more appropriate and that wouldn't involve like first person shooting or be like Fortnite? Are there some other alternatives? And then how do we play those kinds of games in a way that honors Christ? I find that sometimes with these levels, and you talked about game mechanics, that students and kids playing them can get, not even kids, can get adults, can get frustrated if they don't make the level and do all those things. So how do we
Mm-hmm.
play in a responsible way?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because that's also part of what's great about games, like the frustration aspect of it. So the frustration aspect is what's sometimes the worst about it. Like we fail, and so we get upset and feel bad, right? And get angry, which is what we do anytime we mess up anything in life. But games give us more opportunities, but they also give us more opportunities to succeed and to feel good and to feel accomplished. And I think that's a generally like a good thing. Like obviously we need to be careful. There's limits to all these kinds of things, but games give us positive feelings, and they're fun. Like they're really enjoyable and fun. And I think it's really important that we recognize that our God is the inventor of fun. He created fun, and he's not opposed to us having like pleasurable experiences in moderation, as long as those are not, hindering our lives in some other way. So yeah, I think a responsible engagement with video games is going to be different for everybody, for each individual, but it's playing in a way that, we can say what's the greatest commandment? It's to love God with all of our heart, and then our neighbor as ourselves. So we need to play in such a way that helps us do both those things. So we play to go to a virtual world and explore it and have fun and use our imagination. And we can play with thankfulness in our hearts, recognizing that this video game that we're playing is a gift from God that he's given to me for my good. And so that means I want to engage it really responsibly. But then that also means, like, of course, knowing when it's taken an unhealthy place in our hearts or in our lives, when it's hurting our relationships or taking up so much of our time that we're not giving thought and attention to our spouses, or not giving thought and attention to our children, or not or to our studies or our jobs. So I think it's important to have accountability in our lives with all the things that we do, including media engagement. So there's been a handful of times when I've sort of started to have a little bit of an unhealthy relationship with a game that I'm really into. And I just have a really good relationship with my wife, where it sounds like I'm bragging. I don't mean to say on this issue, not in every way. I'm not saying my relationship with my wife is like better than anybody else's necessarily, but on this issue of video games, she just kind of has permission in my life to say, hey, I think you're playing that a little bit too much. And so then we immediately have a conversation, and I dial it back and make sure I'm not being irresponsible. So we should all invite that kind of accountability in our lives, I think, not necessarily just like I described with my wife, but have some people who hold you accountable and who you talk about these things with, or people who have license that you give license to speak up. I think that can be really helpful. But, think about, let's ask ourselves the question, like, I can't answer this for everybody who's listening to this podcast, but let's ask ourselves the question, how can I engage video games in a way that's going to glorify God? How can I play with thankfulness in my heart towards God? How can I play missionally? I think there's some real opportunities with video games to connect with people, to meet new people, to have an enjoyable time with the people around us and build a relationship with them and point them to Christ. Just the fact that so many people in our culture are really into video games means there's a really big opportunity there to meet them where they're at, and connect with them and build a relationship and point them to Christ.
I do think, like you were saying, that there are opportunities there when you think about it. I think there's something like, I heard recently, a couple 100 million people that play video games. I mean, it's a very common thing. And even some adults would, if they would say, well, I'm not a video gamer, yet they, we'll stand in line at the bank and, well, I don't know if people go into the bank anymore, stand in line somewhere at the DMV and, and then play, some, like you said, like video game that's
Clash
on,
of Clans
or like I was
yeah.
saying, Candy Crush or any of those kinds of things that you would be playing just kind of on your phone, like a phone video game. Angry Birds was a thing like several years ago. That was a big video
Yeah.
game that everyone was trying to play.
Yeah, now I think some of the big ones are like Clash Royale and Clash of Clans
I
and
cannot. For me, I don't know. I don't have any patience. I just can't even. I don't know. Video games are not for me. That's what I know. I just cannot get into
yeah.
them. But I will say to people that when I was growing up, my parents didn't allow me to watch any television. And so all I could do was read, and reading is a great thing. But I did get into a habit of, similarly, I think, as some teens can with video games, where if I didn't feel like doing other things, I could just sit there for hours and hours and hours and read. And it's gotten to be a point where sometimes my husband would joke like, "Oh, if I get into a good book, then he's become a book widow. I'm just going to sit there until I finish it, and I'm not going to, I
Yeah.
won't be folding laundry like I should be and other things."
Yeah.
And he'll
Yep.
have to tell me like, "Don't make me a book widow." I remember when I discovered the Harry Potter series, I like
Yeah.
had to read the whole thing, And
Yeah.
so, and then I'd be exhausted in the day because I was like, "Oh, after work, I, did stuff, and then I wanted to stay up and read." And then before I knew it, like 4 or 5 hours had gone by. It's like 2 a.m, and I'm still reading this book because I really want to finish it. So I do think that we need to realize that this can be true of any good thing that God gives us, whether it be a book or binge watching your favorite TV series or whatever it is. So there's that.
Yeah, video games are just the latest thing. They're the newest medium of all those of like out of like music and books and film and TV shows. Video games are the new one. So it's the one we're the most worried about right now. But really, you're right, we need to have responsible relationships with all of these things. And it's the newest one. So it's the one we understand the least. So it's the easiest one to get really worked up and worried about.
Yeah.
Whenever it's not as hard as, what I want to say to a lot of parents out there is that it's not as hard as you might think. Like, you're going to need some patience. It's going to take some time. It's going to be hard at times to help your kids develop good habits, because there's a lot of people in the world that don't have good habits. But it's not as hard as maybe you might think. And and help is out there, and also just for yourself. Like, if we really shouldn't just be talking about kids, because like I said, 35 is the average age of, I think, most gamers. So for yourself, like, really work on developing responsible habits here so that you can model them for your family.
Well, too, I mean, adults might not be playing video games, but they can get, sucked into reading like every single article on your favorite news site, or, spending too much time on Instagram or Facebook or whatever.
Yeah. And these days, doing both those things can actually cause a lot of aggression.
That's true.
Right?
When
like
things,
paying attention to our current news cycle and or social media can be sources. Those can be things that aren't really making our lives better, at least at the level in which we're engaging them. Now, of course we can engage social media in such a way that's really good and beautiful and helping us develop relationships with people, and reach people for Christ. But there's certainly limits there, and we need to learn to be responsible and set good limits for ourselves.
Well, can you recommend other games besides first-person shooters, if there are? And I realize, not for some people, they might not want to do any video games. Like, I didn't do any television, or in our family, our kids don't have smartphones as teenagers. My oldest didn't get a smartphone until he left for college, because at that point it's kind of a necessity. But, if you as a family make a decision, okay, we are going to allow some limited video games, what would you suggest that would be appropriate for Christian, young people?
Yeah. And I do want to say about the violence of some of these first-person shooters, it's important to understand context. I'll give a few games here in a minute that are not violent at all, really. But it's important to understand context. Like, your kid may be really into Fortnite because they like the competitiveness of it, or they like the team, maybe they're playing like the team versions of, or something that's really team oriented, like Overwatch. And they just like how this is a really good team experience where everybody has to fit into their role. And so they're not actually playing because they like to see, a virtual character die, right? Like, it's important to understand why they like to play it. So, and I say that not saying you should let your kids play these games, but there's probably some listening to this podcast who do let their kids play them, and I just want to at least recognize that there are, that it's not necessarily an obsession with the violent content that's going on there. So I just think that's important to recognize. But yeah, there's lots of great games out there. I mean, we could go all day about it, but the Mario games a lot of times are great. Mario Kart is a great game to play with your family. That's a great multiplayer game. There is Overcooked, which is a great, it's a cooking game. It's a cooperative cooking game. It's actually really hard, and it's really great, team building type of experience. We have an article actually at lovethynerd.com that's titled 8 Better Games for Kids Than Fortnite. So we're suggesting 8 games to check out that would be better experience, have better reward structures for kids than what Fortnite does. I think Minecraft can be, when, obviously there will be parents out there who are concerned about how much their kids are into Minecraft. But Minecraft is primarily about creativity, and especially if you just play the creative mode, it's like building with Legos. And I think when played in moderation, it can be great for kids. There's a game called Rumbo that's sort of a competitive, running game, platforming, jumping on platforms and kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, really, every day there's a great game coming out for kids. Stardew Valley is another one I would recommend. That's a game about starting a farm and managing a farm. That's pretty great. Pokemon Go is a game that'll get you outside, chasing after. Although you're on a mobile device, but it'll get you outside in the real world, searching for Pokemon. Yeah, so those are a few that I would mention.
And I'm sure there used to be some old city building games, but I know that there's probably out there where you're creating a city and building your farm and those kinds of things.
City Skylines is the newest one, or kind of one of the newest ones that people really like. Of course, SimCity is still fairly popular. But yeah, I would encourage people to check out City Skylines. Is great.
And you briefly mentioned, but I want to end in asking you a little bit more about, video games, as you said, that they can be missional. So what are ways in which video games can be a springboard for apologetics, because that's what this podcast focuses on, and sharing the gospel and talking about the existence of God, and how do we use that as kind of a tool for evangelism? Because in the gaming industry, there's a fair amount of, there's Christians that are involved in gaming, but there's also a fair amount of atheists that are gaming. So how do we start those conversations about, does God exist even?
Yeah. So I know that firsthand because I actually host a podcast through Love Thy Nerd called Humans of Gaming, where we interview people in the games industry about their spiritual beliefs, about what they believe about God, and the world and life. So primarily we have video game designers on, people who make video games, and more often than not, they're agnostic or they're atheists. And so that podcast in itself has been an opportunity to kind of, for lack of a better word, plant seeds, build relationships with people and have just kind of open and honest conversations about those kinds of things, because nobody else is talking to them about those kinds of things. So a really simple way you can be missional in the way that you play video games is just by being Christ-like when you game. When you play games online with other people, be as Jesus-like as you can. Be kind and be loving and be affirming and encouraging to people. There's a problem with toxicity in online gaming, where people who play online games can sometimes be really cruel to other players and say really hurtful things. And I don't think it's a majority of people who play video games or play video games online, but it's an awful vocal minority, And so one of the things you can do to build relationships with people online is just be as polar opposite of that as you can, because then people will see you as someone who's kind and fun to play games with. If you're encouraging and you pick people up when they struggle in a game rather than saying, "Oh, you're terrible, you're worthless," but rather going like, "Hey, you can do it. You're doing great. Come on, I'll help you. Let me show you how to do this," as you're playing video games with someone else online. Like that immediately can bond you with other people and provide opportunities to build relationships with people. I know plenty of people who have ended up hanging out in the real world, being in each other's weddings, groomsmen and bridesmaids in each other's weddings and things like that, who met online playing video games together. I'd encourage people to think about getting involved with Love Thy Nerd, this organization that I co-founded and helped lead. Write about video games or talk about video games. One of the simplest ways is just have conversations with the people around you who play them. Ask good questions. Be curious about your friends who play video games and why they play them. Just have conversations with them. But with Love Thy Nerd, you can go on a video game mission trip with us, where you go to a show like Penny Arcade Expo, which is a massive video game trade show where they show off games to fans. And you can go to that show and help us point people to Jesus and tell people how much Jesus loves them and desires a relationship with them. So, just get creative, but there are ways to build relationships with people in this space and opportunities for real world missional impact.
I totally agree. I think that there's so many great things about gaming. I don't know that much about video gaming, but we've mentioned in the previous podcast that you were with that I play board games. And I would say the gaming community, on one hand, can be so inclusive in terms of just all different kinds of people game, but at the same time, there's some things that happen that are so incredibly toxic. You get so discouraged. And so if you can be a light for Christ in there, I think a lot of times there's not a lot of room for women in gaming. And so if I've been online and mention just inappropriate ways that women are depicted and, people come after you or whatever, it's an opportunity to try to dispassionately provide a good argument for the value of all people, including women, in gaming spaces. And so I agree with you that there are opportunities where a lot of people don't believe in God at all. And I've seen opportunities where maybe somebody's a Christian in a gaming space and is asked a question that's of spiritual nature, and all these people come back after them. It's a way for that I can, if I'm in that space too, try to defend another brother or sister in Christ and help people like diffuse the situation and say what's important about why some people do believe in God. So there is definitely, because it's such a widespread hobby, I guess, for so many people, not just in the United States, but worldwide, it's something that's, growing. And for sure, I'm sure we're going to continue this conversation in the future because, we'll continue to have questions about the ways in which this particular media impacts our culture and us as Christians as well. Well, so finally, I want to end with some fun rapid fire questions for Drew. So Drew, it's November, pumpkin spice latte or pumpkin pie?
Oh, if I have to choose, pie. I don't like pumpkin flavored things in general.
I'm with you on that one. I don't like pumpkin either. And I don't even really like pumpkin pie, but I do bake it. What's one of your favorite hobbies besides video gaming or gaming of any kind?
Yeah, I love hiking and mountain biking. So I just love to get outdoors in general.
Introvert or extrovert?
I think growing up, I always would have said I was extrovert, but now as I get older and have kids, I feel I'm getting more introverted.
Because you're around people all the time. Your kids, you're around them all the time.
Yeah.
And how old were you when you became a Christian?
I was 17, in high school.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Drew, for being a guest on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Today's guest is Drew Dixon, and in the 2018 Volume 41, Number 5 issue, which is out now, Drew has written a feature-length Postmodern Realities column, and his article is called Virtual Violence, Video Game Addiction and the Kingdom of God. To read his article, please subscribe to our journal. A 6-issue subscription is now at a new lower price of $33.50. And to subscribe online, visit equip.org, and the journal makes a great stocking stuffer or a Christmas gift for your pastor, family, friend. And we just urge you to expose more people to the Christian Research Journal, where we talk a lot about cultural apologetic issues just like this one. We'd like to hear from you, so connect with us on social media, like the Bible Answer Man Facebook page, and follow CRI Christian Research Journal, Hank Hanegraaff, and the Bible Answer Man on Twitter. Follow the Bible Answer Man on Instagram, and please subscribe to the Bible Answer Man channel on YouTube. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Postmodern Realities podcast on iTunes. And when you rate and review our podcast, it helps others to find our content. So please share this episode on your social media accounts. Be sure you tune in daily to the Bible Answer Man broadcast hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff, who answers your questions live on air. To ask Hank a question, call 888-ASK-HANK, Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. In addition, head to iTunes and subscribe to Hank Unplugged. It's Hank's new audio podcast. You'll follow Hank off the grid, where he has in-depth conversations with some of the brightest minds discussing topics you care about. So until our next Christian Research Journal author conversation, thanks for listening to the Postmodern Realities podcast.